It's good to be with you here again, and a privilege to be able to speak here. The poet William Cowper wrote many hymns over 250 years ago that are still loved by Christians today and sung by Christians today. Though the name is spelled Cowper, and I used to say Cowper when I was a boy, the Cooper family called it Cooper and insisted on Cooper. So I'm using the word Cooper. Now, I just want to state a couple of things at the outset. Many people have alleged that religion drove Cooper to insanity. There could be nothing further from the truth, as we will be seeing. Some others have little time for William Cowper. A biography by Neil Curry, published in 215, entitled William Cowper, A Revaluation, is very critical of him. The blurb on the back cover of the book states, undeniably one of the great poets, Cowper nevertheless sought inspiration using people and resources, often ruthlessly. To that end, he is shown to have had ultimately a highly defensive view of himself to enable him to work and live, paradoxically, on his own terms. And that's a calumny, and I strongly disagree with Curry, though he's an expert on the poems of Cowper. And Cowper had faults. We'll be seeing, we're not going to gloss over them, but we all have faults. And we are wise not to expose the faults of others while hiding our own. We see where Curry comes from in this statement on page 62 of his book. Evangelicalism, as practiced by Cowper and his companions, was a fundamentalist religion centred firmly on the Bible. Well, it's true, but the way he used it was as a term of slander, really. The Coopers were a very influential family in Hertfordshire. Many held high positions in ruling circles, and the family as a whole owned over 10,000 acres of land in Hertfordshire. Cooper's father John was rector of Berkhamsted in Hertfordshire and chaplain to King George II, but he wasn't an evangelical. William's mother, Anne Donne, was able to trace her descent from Henry III through 4 different lines, including Mary Bowling, who was Anne Boleyn's sister. She married John Cooper, who was 9 years her senior, in 1728, when she was 25. She had 7 children, including a set of twins, between 1729 and 1737, all of them dying as infants, except for William, who was born in November 1731, and John, who was born on the 7th of November 1737, and Anne Cooper died 6 days after John's birth, 2 weeks before William's 6th birthday. He had many precious memories of his mother. He was to write to a friend, Joseph Hill, 47 years later, I can truly say that not a week passes, perhaps I might with equal veracity say a day, in which I do not think of her. Such was the impression her tenderness made upon me, though the opportunity she had for showing it was so short. His father remarried, but Cooper was far from close to his stepmother Rebecca, and his cousin, Lady Hesketh, described her as disagreeable enough in all conscience. She died 6 years after Cooper's father. Though his father lived till 1756, there's no record of William living at home except for the 9 months when he was 18 years of age. After his mother's death, he was sent to boarding school at a place called Market Street, 7 miles from home, where he was bullied for 2 years by a 15-year-old. And this 15-year-old knew how to hide the bullying. Cowper wrote, "I well remember being afraid to lift up my eyes upon him, higher than his knees, and that I knew him by his shoe buckles better than any part of his dress." When his tormentor was found out, he was immediately expelled from the school. The bullying of this fragile child, mourning the loss of his mother, had a profound effect upon him. He was sent to an oculist in Westminster when he was 8 years old. That's straight after this bullying episode and the bully being expelled, because he had problems with his eyes. And he stayed there for 2 years and went to Westminster School until he was 18. Now, he had many happy years at Westminster School, which was the finest in England at that time, surpassing Eton. He was head of his house. He excelled at football and the primitive form of cricket. The boys were allowed to listen to debates in the House of Commons, which was right near, where seats were reserved for them. They visited the sights of London, including the famous asylum for the insane, Bethlehem Royal Hospital, known as Bedlam, where they were amused by the antics of some of the inmates who were treated cruelly and taunted in this asylum. In a letter to John Newton, years later in 1784, Cowper wrote, "The madness of some of them had such a humorous air and displayed itself in so many whimsical freaks that it was impossible not to be entertained. At the same time that I was angry with myself for being so." Cowper at Westminster acquired an excellent knowledge of Latin and Greek classics, and this is what interested him. His father meant well, wanting him to have a good and well-paid legal career, and on leaving Westminster he was an apprentice to a lawyer for 3 years, but he didn't apply himself to the profession which his father chose for him, and he became very financially impoverished as a lawyer. He had chambers in the Inner Temple in London, but he studied literature and was more interested in that, as I said. Soon after entering the Inner Temple, he wrote, "I was struck with such a dejection of spirits as none but they who have felt the same can have the least conception of. Day and night I spent upon the rack, lying down in horror and rising up in despair." This continued for 12 months. Ashley Cowper, William's uncle, was a very influential lawyer in London. He had 3 daughters, Harriet, who through marriage was to become Lady Hesketh, Theodora and Elizabeth. William fell in love with Theodora, the middle sister, and she also was smitten by William. He wrote a dozen poems to her, or about her, in which he referred to her as Delia. These weren't published until after his death. They were courting for 4 years, but her father was adamant that William was not suited for her, and he refused to allow her to marry him. He gave as his reason that it was because they were cousins and that wasn't healthy. But another reason not stated was that he was unable to earn sufficient to support her because of his failure as a lawyer. Her father's opposition to her marrying Cowper didn't abate, and the relation finished abruptly in 1756. Theodora always loved William, and she remained unmarried throughout her life, dying in 1824. As I said, Cooper had very little money, but he had a very good friend, Joseph Hill, who was a rich lawyer, and he gave money to Cooper regularly. In 1757, he made several unsuccessful attempts at suicide. On the one occasion, he mixed up opium into a drink, and he started to drink and he passed out. And then someone, while he was half conscious, rang the door, or banged at the door, and he let them in, and he was so flustered he threw the rest of the drink away. Another time, he took his the girdle from around him, and he hung himself and found himself on the floor unconscious. He had broken. When he was 31 years of age, through the influence of his uncle Ashley Cooper, he was appointed reading clerk to the House of Lords, but resigned to take an inferior position. A matter arose which demanded that he appeared at the bar of the House of Lords, and he had a breakdown. His mental and physical state had deteriorated so much in 1763, when he was 32 years of age, that his brother and cousin, Martin Madden, who was an evangelical clergyman, decided he would have to be treated in an asylum run by a Dr. Nathaniel Cotton in St Albans. When Cooper heard that they wanted to commit him to an asylum, his mind went back to Bedlam, and he was angry, and he remembered just how awful that place was, and he shouted up, "Do you think I'm mad?" These events led to Cooper's conversion. He'd suffered insanity and delusions long before he became a Christian, if you read his life. He was put in the care of Dr. Nathaniel Cotton in St Albans, remaining there for 2 years. Now, Dr. Cotton was a superb physician, but even better, he was a very keen Christian. Around the asylum, there were Christian books. There were Bibles in every room. And he witnessed to Cooper and others, and he was a caring, kind man, so different from many who ran these homes for the insane at that time. And Cooper was converted in 1764. Cooper picked up the Bible one day, a Bible. The first verse he read was Romans 3:25. Now I'm going to read the previous verse as well. Being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God set forth to be a propitiation by his blood through faith to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance God had passed over the sins that were previously committed. Cooper wrote, "Immediately I received strength to believe it, and the full beams of the Son of Righteousness shone upon me. I saw the sufficiency of the atonement he'd made, my pardon sealed in his blood, and all the fullness and completeness of his justification. In a moment, I believed and received the gospel. Unless the almighty arm had been under me, I think I should have died with gratitude and joy. My eyes filled with tears, and my voice choked with transport. I could only look up to heaven in silence, overwhelmed with love and wonder." We see here, don't we, how God moves in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. This wasn't a frightening providence that fell upon Cooper, or was shining on Cooper, when he was committed to that asylum. It was a smiling face of God. Cooper was to write later, and this is in all the hymns, "I thirst, but not as once I did, the vain delights of earth to share. Thy wounds, Emmanuel, all forbid that I should seek my pleasures there. It was the sight of thy dear cross first weaned my soul from earthly things and taught me to esteem as dross the mirth of fools, the pomp of kings. On leaving Dr. Cotton's establishment in 1765, William's brother John found him accommodation in Huntingdon, which was 15 miles from Cambridge, where John was a minister and also a highly regarded fellow of Corpus Christi College at the university. And he began attending church in Huntingdon, where he was befriended by the Unwin family, especially the son William. He became a very regular guest in their home. Morley Unwin was a clergyman whose wife Mary was 20 years younger, and she was also a very keen Christian. Their son William was 21 and daughter Susanna 18. Cowper became very close to the family, and they invited him to lodge with them, and he went there as a paying guest in November 1765. Now, Morley Unwin was not an inspirational man, and I guess not at all evangelical. It's recorded that the parish books contain several resolutions of censure upon him for neglect of duty, and once he was nearly dismissed. Throughout his life, Cowper enjoyed long walks. He and Mrs. Unwin enjoyed such walks, and in the home they read together the Bible, a number of Christian books, including John Newton's autobiography, and they sang hymns with son William, with Mrs. Unwin playing the harpsichord. But these happy times were shattered in June 1767 when Morley Unwin, on his way to preach at a distant church, was thrown from his horse and fractured his skull, dying 4 years later. Mary Unwin now faced having to move from the manse which would be needed by her husband's successor. She prayed that the Lord would lead them to a place where they could sit under an evangelical ministry. A friend who knew John Newton told him of Mr. Unwin's death, and Newton went from Olney to Huntingdon to comfort the widow from the word of God. Mary Unwin warmed to Newton, and so did her lodger, William Cowper, who was delighted to meet the ex-slave trader whose autobiography he'd read. Cowper and Newton had certain things in common. Both had lost their mother in early childhood. Each had been close to death, and they knew Christ as their saviour. When he heard that Mrs. Unwin and her family had to move home, Newton suggested that they move to Olney. On the 14th of September 1767, Mrs. Unwin, Susanna Unwin and William Cowper moved to temporary accommodation in Olney. William Unwin did not move with them because at that time he was at Cambridge University. Mrs. Unwin was soon taken ill, and her friends were convinced that she wouldn't recover. She'd shown Cowper more care and kindness than any other. And he wrote to his aunt, Mrs. Madden, in 1767, asking her to pray with Mary Unwin. He also composed the hymn and attached it to that letter, "Oh, for a closer walk with God." It's probably the first hymn that we know of. God heard their prayers, and she recovered, and in 1768 she moved into a new home in Olney with daughter Susanna and Cowper, which John Newton had helped them to acquire. This home was Orchardside. Some of you have seen it and been there, which is now the Cowper Museum in Olney. Newton and Cowper spent much time in fellowship together, walking and conversing. Now, Orchardside was separated from Newton's vicarage by an orchard, and Newton paid the owner, the Mrs. Asprey, an annual fee of 1 guinea so he could cross her orchard to gain a shortcut to the vicarage. As I've mentioned, Cowper had very little income. He was never competent at handling money. He had a small inheritance from his father, who died in 1765, and Theodora Cowper anonymously contributed £50 a year, anonymously via her sister, Lady Hesketh, and there were also gifts from Joseph Hill. Now, most of the women in Olney were lace makers and worked very long hours for very little pay. There was a lot of poverty there, and Cowper had funds provided by a wealthy merchant, John Thornton, and he visited the poor, was able to distribute food to them from these funds. Now, one writer observed, and the detractors of Cowper don't mention things like this, it was no means a rare occurrence to find him praying by the sickbed of the poorest cottager, or guiding the devotions of some miserable being who, having lived for this world, attempted to seek God only in the departing moments of existence. Someone else commented of him, there must have been something remarkable, for with all his shyness, he had more and better friends than almost any poet we could name. To know him was to love him, and few loved him by halves. God was greatly blessing the labours of John Newton at this time, and he felt the large size of the church at Olney would rob the midweek meeting with its informality and warmth of that informality. Newton would preach there, and there was prayer. They met in the home of a lady named Molly Mole. When she moved to another cottage, they moved with her. Newton called this the New Molehill. Molly's cottage soon became too small, but Newton wanted to keep the intimacy of these meetings rather than use his church premises. So he approached his friend Lord Dartmouth for the use of the rooms in the great house which he owned. Lord Dartmouth readily agreed, and the great room in the house was redecorated and officially opened on the 17th of April 1769. He asked Cowper, Newton did, to write an appropriate hymn for this opening meeting, and Cowper penned this hymn that we all love. Jesus, where'er thy people meet, there they behold thy mercy seat. Where'er they seek thee, thou art found, and every place is hallowed ground. Newton wrote a hymn, which isn't found in our hymn books today, as far as I know. O Lord, our languid souls inspire. Newton also used the room for children's meetings where he could talk, preach and reason with them in their own little way. He would ask Cowper to pray at the meeting several days beforehand the meeting, and he may have been unwise in this, because one friend said that Cowper's mind was agitated for some hours preceding, but his trepidation wholly subsided as soon as he began to speak in prayer. And that timidity, which he felt at every appearance before his fellow creatures, gave place to an awful, that's awesome, yet delightful consciousness of the presence of his Saviour. These prayer meetings were richly blessed, attracted others from other churches. Andrew Fuller, friend of William Carey, quoted a friend who said, of all the men that I've ever heard pray, no one equalled Mr. Cowper. Newton said He spoke with self-abasement and humiliation of spirit, yet with that freedom and fervency, as if he saw the Lord whom he addressed face to face. It was probably at this time that Cowper began to write a commentary on the Gospel of John, but he only completed the first chapter because of subsequent illnesses in his life. In the autumn of 1769, Cowper's brother John took ill while returning from a journey to Wales. Now, William had often witnessed to his brother, who didn't accept his evangelical faith, though John did attend Newton's church when visiting his brother in Olney. When he arrived at his home just outside Cambridge, he was very ill, coughing up blood, and he sent word to William to visit him, which Cowper did. William was distressed to see that his sick brother had no Bible at his bedside, but a book of plays. And John recovered, and William was able to return to Olney. But in February, this is 1770, William had an urgent summons to visit John, whose physicians said he was so ill that he had little chance of recovery. Cowper sat by his bedside day after day, praying and reading the poems of George Herbert to him, knowing that John appreciated this Christian poet. On the 10th of March, William found John praying earnestly. On seeing William, John suddenly threw his arms around his neck and said, "Brother, if I live, you and I shall be more like one another than with thee. But whether I live or not, all is well, all will be well. I know it. I know it will. I have felt that which I never felt before. I have peace in myself, and if I live, I hope that I may be made a messenger of peace to others. I have learned that in a moment, which I could not have learned by reading many books for many years." And he expressed the hope that he would be able to visit Olney and spend an hour with Mr. Newton talking over the things of God. On the day before he died, though in great pain, he summoned up enough strength to faintly smile at William and say, "Brother, I'm as happy as a king." He died 20th of March 1770. Most of the hymns in the Olney hymn book were written in 1771 and 1772 and published as a book in 1779. At the end of 1772, Mrs. Unwin and Cowper were engaged to be married. He was living in the home. She was his carer, and it didn't seem right that he should be there because the daughter had by now left home. And their marriage was planned for early 1773, but Cowper was plunged into a melancholic state in January 1773, and Newton spent the whole day with him from early morning. A month later, he had a dream, and no biographer mentions this dream apart from Thomas Wright, who wrote a biography at the end of the 19th century. He was a schoolmaster in Olney. And Thomas Wright rightly points to the significance of this dream with the effect it had on Cowper. He had a dream in which he heard words pronouncing his doom, and he was convinced that God had cast him off. He suffered deep depression for 4 years, but there were diversions that occupied him at this time. He loved animals and had 3 hares which had been brought to him as leverets in 1774. They were all males, but he called them Puss, Tiny and Bess. They lived with him in the house, and Puss allowed Cowper to carry him round in his arms, licked his fingers to show affection, Bess was the first of the hares to die. Tiny lived for 9 years, and Puss just short of 12 years. Lady Hesketh observed that he had at one time 5 rabbits, 3 hares, 2 guinea pigs, a magpie, a jay, a starling, 2 goldfinches, 2 canaries, and 2 doves. There was also a squirrel which played with one of the hares. He learned to draw in 1780, but gave that up after a year because of the strain on his eyesight. He took up gardening, growing vegetables and flowers, and became an accomplished carpenter. He wrote, "There's not a squire in all the country who can boast of having made better squirrel houses, hutches for rabbits, or bird cages than myself." He also made a small greenhouse for himself. John Newton left Olney in January 1780 to be rector at St Mary Walnut Church in London. Before he left Olney, he introduced Cowper to William Bull, a dissenting minister from Newport Pagnell, some 5 miles away, and Bull faithfully visited Cowper every 2 weeks. Now, Bull was a great admirer of the Christian verse of Madame Guyon, and persuaded Cowper to translate a work from the French into English, which he did. It may not have been a wise thing because she was very introspective, and some of the verses Cowper translated would not have really cheered him up. Here's one of them that Cowper translated. "My claim to life, though sought with earnest care, no light within me, or without me shows. Once I had faith, but now in self-despair find my chief cordial and my best repose." So it's in self-despair she found her comfort. In 1781, he wrote his poem Expostulation, which shows excellent spiritual insight as he looks at the religion found in Israel in Bible times, right through to the times of Christ being on earth, and how its coldness and departure was dreadful, and he likened it to the state of much of the established church in England. And he opens it, "Why weeps the muse for England? In England's case to move the muse to tears." And then he goes on to write, "When nations are to perish in their sins, 'tis in their church the leprosy begins. The priest whose office is with zeal sincere to watch the fountain and preserve it clear, carelessly nods and sleeps upon the brink, while others poison what the flock must drink. Or waking at the call of lust alone, infuses lies and errors of his own. His unsuspecting sheep believe it pure, and tainted by the very means of cure, catch from each other a contagious spot, the foul forerunner of a general rot. Then truth is hushed, that heresy may preach, and all is trash that reason cannot reach. Then God's own image on the soul impressed becomes a mockery and a standing jest. And faith the root whence only cancer rise, the graces of a life that wings the skies, loses at once all value and esteem, pronounced by greybeards a pernicious dream. Then ceremony leads her bigots forth, prepare to fight for shadows of no worth, while truths on which eternal things depend find not, or hardly find, a single friend. That's true today, isn't it? In 1781, he saw 2 women pass his house. One he knew, Mrs. Jones, from a neighbouring village, but it was a sister he saw, Lady Austin, a really vivacious woman, and he invited them to tea, and they accepted. Cowper described her as one who laughed and made me laugh. He soon spent much time in her company. She was 5 years younger than himself, and to him she became Anna. His friendship with her brought out his creativity. She encouraged him to write the ballad of John Yelpin, for which he became famous, to write Milton's Latin poems and the works of Homer. She gave him the task of writing poems on various things around him. The first poem, The Sofa, made him famous when it was published. He called the collection of poems The Task because she'd given him that task of doing it. And he made several memorable statements in the task, one being, God made the country, man made the town. Lady Austen fell in love with Cooper, not knowing of his commitment to Mrs. Unwin. Cooper saw their friendship as platonic rather than romantic, but it dawned on him eventually that Lady Austen was in love with him. In the spring of 1784, he wrote a tender letter to her to sever their friendship. Lady Austen was very disappointed, hurt and bitter towards Cooper and burnt his letter. She later went to live in France and married a French nobleman. Lady Hesketh had lost touch with Cooper in 1767 at the height of his evangelical fervour. She renewed contact in 1785 following his fame for the poem The Task and his ballad of John Cooper. Lady Hesketh did not like Newton. She was not evangelical, wasn't sympathetic to the evangelical faith at all. In 1786, Cooper and Mrs. Unwin left Orchardside to live at the lodge on the estate at Weston Underwood, 1 mile from Oldham, belonging to a wealthy Roman Catholic family, the Throckmortons. The spacious grounds had been designed by Capability Brown, and Cooper and Mrs. Unwin had complete freedom to wander through this vast and beautiful estate. And the Throckmortons formed a very close friendship with them. Cooper wrote poems for Mrs. Throckmorton about her pets and so on and things around them. And they sent food round to their lodge, fed them well. And in a letter to Mrs. Unwin's son William, Cooper wrote, "They are papists, but much more amiable than many Protestants." Soon after moving to Weston Lodge, Cooper and Mrs. Unwin had a terrible shock. Her son William suddenly died of typhus. He then suffered another period of melancholy from January to June 1787. Such was the state of his mind, he wouldn't meet with William Bull, his friend. He attempted to hang himself, but Mrs. Unwin accidentally entered his room and cut him down before he actually died. Now, William Wilberforce with John Newton began to campaign for the abolition of slavery. Newton wrote something called Thoughts on the African Slave Trade. Now, Lady Hesketh, like Cooper, hated the slave trade, and she encouraged him to write 5 slave ballads, which were completed in the spring of 1788. They were put to music and sold throughout the land and made a terrific impact. One of them, The Negro's Complaint, was particularly powerful and poignant. And Mrs. Cooper puts himself in the place of this slave. Forced from home and all its pleasures, Afric's coast I left forlorn, to increase a stranger's treasures, o'er the raging billows borne. Men from England bought and sold me, paid my price in paltry gold, but though slave they have enrolled me, mines are never to be sold. Deaf our nation, brutes, deem our nation brutes no longer, till some reason ye shall find worthy of regard and stronger than the colour of our mind. Slaves of gold whose sordid dealings tarnish all your boasted powers, prove that you have human feelings, ere you proudly question ours. As I said, this made powerful impact, and in 1807, an act was passed in Parliament which outlawed the landing of slaves in British colonies from March 1808. Newton and Cooper didn't live to see that law pass. John and Mary Newton visited Cooper and Mrs. Unwin in August 1786, seeing them over several days. He was offered the post of Poet Laureate in 1790, but declined it. Mrs. Unwin suffered strokes in 1791 and January 1792 and could hardly care for Cooper. He became a carer. He wrote 13 verses to her. Here is one of them. Thy spirits have a fainter flow. I see thee daily weaker grow. 'Twas my distress that brought thee low, my Mary. Lady Hesketh was shocked when she visited them in 1793, and they needed care. She stayed with them for 2 years. In 1794, in the April, he was granted, Cooper was, by the King, a pension of £300 a year. Quite considerable at that time, but really he was past caring now, and money was coming in. In 1793, John Johnson, a relative from Norfolk, known to Cooper as Johnny, and Lady Hesketh persuaded Cooper to move to Norfolk, which they did in the January of that year. Eventually, they settled in Maunsley, and Cooper enjoyed country walks. They moved to Johnny's house in East Dereham. In October 1796, Mrs. Unwin died there in the December. Cooper had read years earlier the story of a man who fell overboard. Though a good swimmer, he perished in the sea. He wrote the poem The Castaway, in which he compared the fate of that unfortunate sailor with that of himself. When snatched from all effectual aid, we perished each alone. But I beneath the rougher sea, and whelmed in deeper gulfs than he. In April 1800, he wrote a letter to John Newton to thank Newton for the book that he'd sent to him, but he was approaching death. And Johnny Johnson spoke to him that he'd soon be free from the miseries of both soul and body, and he'd be in a world to which he's hastening. He'd go to a merciful Redeemer who prepared unspeakable happiness for all his children and therefore for him. When he died a few days later, Johnson observed, the expression with which his countenance had settled was one of calmness and composure, mingled as it were with holy surprise. He was interred by the side of Mrs. Unwin in East Dereham Church. Cooper had a brilliant mind, was an encourager of others. We see that from the many letters that he wrote. I have a book of his poems and translations that fill 600 pages. But, and I'm coming to a close now, Cooper was what we could call hard work. People like John and Mary Newton and Mrs. Unwin spent thousands upon thousands of hours caring for him. Had they not done so, we wouldn't have had the benefits of his hymns and poems. At his best, he showed compassion for the poor and oppressed, and he was used in helping Newton and Wilberforce to fight for the abolition of the slave trade in Britain and its colonies. Now, we may know Christians who are difficult, hard work, but how we should be patient and persevere with them. And there will be encouragements as well as disappointments. I'm encouraged that the Lord is pleased to use us despite our faults. We're faced in the 21st century with mental illness on a massive scale, and Christians are not immune. Now listen, you may come here feeling low and depressed and down, but you can be used by the Lord despite all that Cooper was in a remarkable way.
Amen.
Christians are not exempt from suffering, and dementia takes a terrible toll of many lovely people. How we need to encourage one another and help each other. Now, it may be asked, why didn't God deliver Cooper from these dreadful seasons of insanity? But it was through one of them. as his conversion came about in Dr. Cotton's asylum. And there's no easy answers to the things that happen to us. But our life here on earth is only a dot, a spot on the timeline of thousands and thousands of years. We live in a fallen world, and though our sins are forgiven, if we're Christians, we cannot escape the effects of sin. And the last enemy that will be destroyed is death. We may perceive a frowning providence, but God's smiling face is upon his children, working out his good and gracious purposes. The only frowning providence is upon those who reject God's offer of mercy and forgiveness of sins through the Lord Jesus Christ. And that's a terrifying position to be in. And if there's anyone here who doesn't know the Lord Jesus and his preciousness, I would urge you with all my heart to seek him and to find him and to know him. The Apostle Paul wrote, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, redemption of our body. And Paul said, I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the grace which shall be revealed in us.
Amen.